This wasn't just some routine tally or a boring procedural hurdle. This was a flat-out rejection of the notion that a single person can bypass the American people, sidestepping Congress and public debate, to put our sons and daughters in the line of fire. The count is in 52 in favor, 47 against, and the motion carries. The resolution is set. But the real story wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the room where it happened. Just a week prior, that very same floor was a literal crime scene, overrun by a mob intent on flipping a democratic election event that ended in 5 deaths. For the critics, this was the moment the facade finally crumbled. Exposing years of rhetoric designed to stoke fear, the tension was suffocating. Some in the room realized they had narrowly escaped with their lives. The choice became a binary one. Do we impeach again and risk further fracturing a divided nation? Or do we leave a man in power who seems capable of inciting a civil war? The consensus for many was clear. He had to be stopped, and he had to be stopped immediately. Then something happened that caught the entire political world by surprise, especially the man in the White House. In a place defined by its rigid traditions, quiet whispers, and slow-moving bureaucracy, senators did the unthinkable. They didn't argue. They didn't give speeches. They simply stood up, turned their backs, and walked out. It was a silent, chilling act of defiance that left the Capitol in a state of shock. Cameras scrambled to capture the exodus. Aides stood frozen in the hallways, and the remaining leadership found themselves staring at a sea of empty mahogany desks. Somewhere, watching the live feed, Donald Trump realized he no longer held the room. This wasn't a choreographed PR stunt or a protest planned by activists. This was a spontaneous fracture within the Senate. Itself, happening without the permission of party bosses or the guidance of leadership offices, it was a move he couldn't counter because there was no one left to talk to. Silence can be the loudest sound in Washington. Sources close to the president say he was completely blindsided. His team was prepared for a fight, for long-winded debates and procedural delay, the usual political theater. They weren't prepared for a physical rejection. And by leaving their seats, these senators were refusing to even acknowledge the legitimacy of what was happening in the Capitol. Walking out isn't just a dramatic exit. It's a declaration that a fundamental line has been crossed. And within minutes, the city was in a frenzy. Phones were blowing up, staffers were sprinting between offices, and leadership was desperately trying to get a handle on a narrative that was already spinning out of control. The internet was on fire. And the inner circle was left asking the one question no one had an answer for. How do we not see this coming? This matters because it breaks the cardinal rule of the Senate. You can argue, you can posturing, and you can fight tooth and nail, but you don't just abandon the floor when that happens. It's not just a disagreement, it's a total collapse of authority. And for a man who builds his world on the perception of total control, that collapse is fatal. What followed wasn't just political fallout, it was pure panic. The realization set in that the Senate had sent a message that couldn't be spun or shouted down, and this was only the beginning. This sudden eruption didn't happen in a vacuum. The pressure had been mounting for days behind closed doors, fueled by last-minute demands and heavy-handed tactics that finally pushed lawmakers to the brink. It was supposed to be a standard session, centered on legislative demands that the White House had framed as non-negotiable. But the breaking point came when senators realized they were being forced to rubber stamp a measure without the chance to review it, debate it, or offer amendments. In the Senate, that is the ultimate red line. The atmosphere shifted from tension to a quiet, burning fury. Notes were passed, looks were exchanged, and the room reached a silent consensus. Staying put meant complicity. Walking out meant resistance. The truly explosive part, it wasn't just the opposition party. A small, crucial group of his own allies were the first to stand up, and that shattered the image of party loyalty that the president relies on. Once those first few seats were empty, the floodgates opened. Leadership tried to regain control. The gavel pounded fruitlessly against the wood, but the damage was done. From the president's perspective, this was the ultimate nightmare. You can't attack an opponent who isn't there. You can't hijack a soundbite when the room is empty. A walkout creates a vacuum, and in politics, a vacuum speaks louder than any speech ever could. Watching from afar, the president saw the chaos play out in real time. He expected the usual partisan bickering, the predictable back and forth he could easily navigate. So instead, he saw his influence evaporating on screen. He reportedly demanded to know who was in charge, who had authorized this, and why he was being humiliated on live television. There were no answers. His inner circle was in a tailspin because a walkout robs you of the ability to dominate the conversation. All the public saw were empty desks and a Senate that refused to play along. He demanded lists of names, who left, who stayed, who could be intimidated into coming back, but the calls to the Hill went unanswered or were met with vague excuses. No one wanted to claim they had control when it was obvious they didn't. The timing couldn't have been worse. His authority was already under fire, and this public display of abandonment suggested a deeper road to loss of discipline and a breakdown of the machinery that usually protected him. The media didn't miss a beat, news anchors were stunned, and analysts struggled to explain the rarity of such a move. It suggested urgency over strategy, a desperate act by people who felt they had no other choice. He understood the signal loud and clear. He could no longer command the loyalty of the very institution that had always bent to his will. As the president fumed, the leadership offices were in a state of total disarray. The walkout exposed just how fragile the grip on power really was. They tried to frame it as a temporary procedural hiccup, but no one was buying it. There had been no warning, no chance to negotiate, and in Washington, a clean surprise like that is a sign of a looming disaster. Behind the scenes, tempers were at a boiling point. Some leaders were livid at the betrayal, while others were secretly relieved that someone had finally stood up. The split was out in the open. The Senate floor was left in a bizarre limbo, with cameras lingering on the empty rows, reinforcing the image of a government that had simply stopped working. By the time the senators started trickling back to their offices, the world had changed. The Senate was no longer a disciplined machine, and his influence was no longer a sure thing. A massive divide had formed. Some feared the inevitable retaliation, while others felt as though they could finally breathe. For the man in the White House, the real danger wasn't the enemies across the aisle, it was the hesitation from the people who were supposed to be on his side. Loyalty had always been maintained through fear, but the walkout proved that some were now willing to take the hit. His reaction was predictable: rage, finger-pointing, and a demand for consequences. Threats were made and names were gathered. In his world, if you aren't 100 with him, you're a traitor. But threats only work if people believe you can still deliver on them. The walkout was a sign that that belief was fading fast. Analysts called it a warning shot, noting that senators are built to handle pressure. They don't just leave unless the system has completely failed. And the image of those empty seats became a symbol of total exhaustion. Ultimately, this exposed a fundamental truth: Congress runs on unwritten rules, not just raw power. When those rules are ignored, the system breaks. Walking out became the only tool left in the box. This shift terrified the establishment on both sides. If this becomes the new normal, the ability to govern disappears, replaced by pure spectacle. Political strategists began rethinking everything: primaries, retirements, and the future of the party. The walkout introduced a level of uncertainty that hadn't existed before. It wasn't loud and it wasn't violent, but it was devastating. It proved that you can challenge authorities simply by refusing to participate. He was caught off guard because he was looking for a fight, but instead he found an empty room. And sometimes having no one to fight is the most dangerous position of all.